Lucy Jones, Losing Eden, Why Our Minds Need the Wild. Narrated by Karen Cass and Marston York.
Nowadays, most of us spend the majority of our time indoors, and this alienation from the natural world is impacting our health. We've become so disconnected from nature that we now think of the Earth's flora and fauna as either an unnecessary frill or something to be dominated and exploited. And yet, new scientific findings show that our dismissal of the natural world actually goes against human nature. Our estrangement from the planet that sustains our existence is causing us severe psychic harm. But how can a person be moved to care about nature if they were never exposed to it? Will a lack of greenery in your life affect your mental health if you don't know what you're missing? These blinks provide insights into the science of our connection with nature and how we can reimagine our relationship with the Earth as equal and mutually beneficial.
Blink 1 of 9.
When author Lucy Jones was recovering from alcoholism, 4 elements helped her start anew. Psychotherapy, medication, community, and nature. The latter came as a surprise. She found it almost by accident when she moved into a new apartment and became emotionally attached to a pear tree outside her bedroom window. Jones loved to gaze at it, rooted, growing, changing, living. When scaffolding went up for construction work on her upstairs neighbour's apartment, blocking her view of the tree, she realised how much she'd relied on the calmness it brought. Her mental health even began to suffer. So she set out to find out why and landed on a new important area of scientific research that explores how contact with nature affects our minds.
The key message here is lack of engagement and connection with nature has triggered a global mental health crisis.
Emerging scientific evidence shows that contact with natural environments actually promotes better mental and physical health on a cellular level. For example, in multiple studies, neuroscientist Christopher Lowry injected mice with M. vacci, a species of bacteria found in soil. He found that it boosted their serotonin levels and prevented stress. These studies leave us wondering if we shouldn't all spend more time playing in the dirt, he told the BBC. What's more, people typically contain vastly more microbial cells than human cells in their bodies. Microbiota promote health when they're diverse, which is possible through exposure to a variety of organisms more often found outdoors. Diverse microbiota can treat or block chronic systemic inflammation, which can lead to cardiovascular disease, inflammatory disorders, and depression. Take one 2018 study that examined 20 young men who'd grown up in either the city or the country. They were asked to prepare a speech and do a tricky mental arithmetic test. The urban dwellers had higher numbers of white blood cells and pro-inflammatory cytokines in the blood, a higher social stress response, suggesting that people who live in cities are at increased risk of chronic inflammation. Today, most people live in cities, spend more time indoors, and have limited exposure to the diverse organisms that make up the natural world. This is resulting in an extinction of experience, a term coined by American ecologist and entomologist Robert Pyle. This describes a vicious cycle that links apathy with ecological destruction. The extinction of common species leads to ignorance and a fraying of our connection with the natural world, which leads to lack of care for the planet. This in turn brings about even further extinction, which fuels the mental health problems that result from a more barren world.
Blink 2 of 9.
Don't you feel calmer walking beneath majestic trees with large canopies than on an exposed, busy street with no greenery? According to biologist E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis, this is a preference that's coded in your DNA. Wilson introduced the term biophilia in his 1984 book of the same name. pioneering the idea that humans have a genetically determined affinity for the natural world. According to Wilson, even if individuals don't feel an innate connection with nature, our brains are marked by our past evolutionary responses and behavior. Today, researchers are successfully testing Wilson's biophilia hypothesis through habitat theory, the idea that we mostly live in park-like grasslands with clusters of trees and water because our ancient ancestors sought out such environments to increase their chances of survival.
The key message here is, we are genetically predisposed to connect with the natural world.
New research shows that we're drawn to nature for reasons rooted in the distant genetic past. For example, Gordon Orions, professor of biology at the University of Washington, worked with psychologist Judith Heerwagen to analyse before and after plans by celebrated 18th century British landscape architect Sir Humphrey Repton. They hypothesised that Repton would try to improve the grounds of private estates and country houses by adding savanna-like elements to his plans. Indeed, they found that Repton very often included clusters of trees and open vistas, the habitat in which humans lived for millions of years, they wrote. Repton's successful after designs suggest that we have an intrinsic bias for certain landscape designs that harken back to the lifestyles of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who, of course, spent much more time in the great outdoors than a typical modern human. E.O. Wilson also argues that humans have an innate animacy of life. That is, we prefer biological activity over non-biological activity from the time we are born. A squirrel is more interesting to our eyes than a candy wrapper, for example. This was tested in a 2008 study in which newborn babies were shown images of random dots and the movement of a walking hen. Babies preferred to watch the biological motion display of the hen, suggesting that our visual perception has evolved to attune us to the movements of other animals. A 2009 evaluation of 50 empirical studies by biologists at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health ultimately proved the merit of biophilia as a hypothesis. They concurred that the natural world has positive effects on the mind. An absence of connection to nature is harmful, and the biophilia trait can be fortified or repressed based on individual learning.
Blink 3 of 9.
While we all have a lot to lose as we grow more disconnected from nature, our children are perhaps the most vulnerable. Consider this. In the United Kingdom, 3 out of 4 children aged 5 through 12 now spend less time outdoors than prison inmates, who are required by the United Nations to get at least 1 hour of exercise outside every day. Technology is perhaps the most obvious culprit, preventing children from getting outside. Kids under 7 spend more than twice as much time looking at screens as they do being outside. But that's not the only thing contributing to their disassociation from the natural world. A widespread safety-first mentality has made parents fearful of letting their children roam, and more congested roads mean it's not as safe for kids to explore the outdoors.
The key message here is, forging a connection with nature in childhood is key to mental and physical development.
City kids face a disadvantage because their opportunities to access nature are limited, especially in low-income and minority communities which receive less funding for public parks. A 1998 Chicago study showed that children who only have access to barren outdoor spaces play less, and their creative play is much lower. This is significant, as creative play is crucial to social, psychological, and creative growth, and children in inner cities are already more likely to have other factors interfere with their development, like poverty or underfunded schools. But there's an uplifting trend. Outdoor nurseries and forest schools, in which teachers frequently take their classes into nature to learn, are growing in popularity in Britain. Kristen Freer founded the holistic outdoor nursery Elves and Fairies after she sent her own children to summer forest school camps in England. She found that they didn't grow up to become cranky and morose teenagers. They remained curious and talkative, which Freer attributed to a childhood spent outdoors. Then, while teaching piano and folk dancing at a Rudolf Steiner school, Freya decided to open a more affordable nursery that also prioritised imagination and creativity. At Elves and Fairies, the children learn to identify plants and insects. They learn math by counting molehills, and they learn emotional development by dealing with different weather conditions. They garden, sing, read stories, learn how to cook their lunches using food they've grown themselves, and enjoy free, creative play outdoors, all the while gaining confidence and self-esteem. The framework for outdoor learning exists, but it's not accessible to everyone. Political will is necessary to implement it on a larger scale. If not, kids will be less likely to appreciate nature and thus less likely to care about protecting the planet when they grow up.
Blink 4 of 9.
Jones had been sober for a couple of years, but she still struggled with feelings of doubt, resentment, and frustration. One day she went for a swim in a cove in Scotland, and these emotions began to recede. She was simultaneously calm and energised. Her brain felt scoured clean. It might have been a reaction to the negative ions that are abundant around the ocean and other natural areas where air molecules are broken apart by crashing waves, moving air or sunlight. Negative ions can help the brain release serotonin and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, calming the body and the mind. When our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, our heart slows, our digestive juices increase, and we feel relaxed. Meanwhile, stress activates the sympathetic nervous system, putting us in fight or flight mode and delaying non-urgent workings like immune function. This is why stress can be so bad for health.
The key message here is nature's multisensory stimulation restores our minds, our nervous system, and our immune system.
In fact, contact with nature can help our systems maintain balance, something the British soldiers of the First and Second World War knew intuitively. They turned to gardening in the trenches, growing poppies, primroses, and forget-me-nots, which offered them hope and psychological resistance from stress. Another way to ease stress is through the Japanese practice of shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, spending at least 2 hours in a forest and breathing deeply. This boosts the immune system by increasing the number of natural killer or NK cells. High NK activity is linked with decreased depression, anxiety, and cancer risk. Or Jones's swimming experience might have been an example of restored attention, a state of mind explained by attention restoration theory, or ART, developed in 1980 by University of Michigan psychology professors Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. According to ART, directed attention, focused on one thing, leads to directed attention fatigue, causing stress, irritability, and difficulty focusing. Meanwhile, effortless attention can be achieved in nature, watching birds fly or leaves rustling, leading to restored attention through feelings like soft fascination. Engaging with nature is hugely beneficial for mental health, but can nature intervention work as a supplementary treatment for people with more severe mental illness, like psychosis and schizophrenia? According to staff at an NHS secure unit, gardening is especially healing and helpful to such patients. It offers the rare opportunity to nurture a living thing, which can impart a sense of purpose and promote patience and resilience.
Blink 5 of 9.
So, if greater access to nature is good for individual mental health, can simple adjustments to landscape design promote happiness in communities? Studies suggest they can. Robert Taylor Homes was a public housing project built on the south side of Chicago in 1962. It was composed of 28 buildings situated between roads and railway tracks, totally isolated from nature. Violent crime and drugs were rampant. A few buildings had trees or grass nearby, while others were barren and paved with concrete. In the late 1990s, the University of Illinois conducted studies at Robert Taylor Homes to examine the impact of physical environments on well-being. The researchers looked at the effect that trees had on people's lives and found that just a few trees and some grass near an apartment could significantly improve the residents' mental health and cognitive functioning. Their findings offered evidence for attention restoration theory. Mental fatigue was worse without access to nature. The greener a building's surroundings were, the lower the crime rate. Trees gave people a place to convene, which strengthened relationships, lowered stress levels, and reduced violence. This research ultimately led Chicago's city government to spend $10 million planting 20,000 trees in the city.
The key message here is people, and by extension societies, need connection with the natural world in order to flourish.
Another study, the Nature Imagery in Prisons project, took a population that is under even more extreme sensory deprivation, prisoners in solitary confinement, and examined what effect nature videos might have on their mental state. At the Snake River Correctional Institution in Oregon, inmates are confined to small cells with windows that face into the building. They are only allowed outside to exercise for 45 minutes a few times per week, in a walled concrete yard with no greenery. Many arrive already mentally unwell and often get worse or take their own lives. In the 2013 to 2017 study devised by University of Utah biology professor Nalini Nadkarni, inmates were divided into two groups. The first was given the option to watch nature videos or exercise outside 5 times per week. The second group could only exercise. The inmates who watched the nature videos received 25% fewer disciplinary reports for violent incidents, which saved the prison thousands of dollars in medical bills. They reported that they felt calmer, less irritable, less tense, and better able to sleep, and staff reported fewer incidents of self-harm and angry outbursts. Now the project is being implemented at prisons in Wisconsin and Nebraska.
Blink 6 of 9.
Time spent in nature often falls on socio-economic lines. As we've seen in earlier blinks, there are fewer parks in deprived parts of towns and cities than in affluent neighbourhoods, which tend to be more verdant. But it goes deeper than that. People in lower socio-economic groups or from racial and ethnic minorities have less access to natural areas. Vulnerable populations suffer more exposure to pollution and toxic chemicals, and society is only becoming more unbalanced as our alienation from nature is exacerbated. Many people believe that worrying about the natural world is a privileged concern, something only the wealthy bother themselves with. But when proximity to nature can determine your health outcome, caring about the natural world is not a luxury. Research by Professor Rich Mitchell of Glasgow University posits that greener neighbourhoods could reduce the health gap between the rich and poor and thus make our society more equal, a concept known as equigenesis.
The key message here is equitable access to nature could reduce the socio-economic health gap.
While studying economic and health inequality early in his career, Mitchell came to recognise that fixing the problem on a large scale would require a redistribution of wealth and income, an economic revolution that's not currently democratically supported. Not without anguish, he shifted his focus to studying resilience. This investigation led him to discover that income-related health inequality was less pronounced for people who live near parks and woodlands, because access to nature reduces stress. In 2015, he led a study of 20,000 people in 34 European countries and found that exposure to nature was the one variable that reduced socio-economic inequality in mental well-being by 40%. Since marginalised groups have historically been denied access to green spaces, and therefore may not have developed an affinity for nature, another obstacle is engagement. In order to make places truly equigenetic, people must be oriented to them. Local community gardens and initiatives around the United Kingdom are trying to do this by offering programmes for children from disadvantaged neighbourhoods and Black, Asian, minority ethnic and refugee or BAME communities. But public funding is often scant or non-existent, and they depend on charities and volunteers for funding. Another antidote to this problem is to include the communities themselves in the park design processes. For example, a Latino neighborhood might embrace picnic facilities, reflecting the cultural fondness for family picnics, or a Muslim community might appreciate separate swimming sections for women and men.
Blink 7 of 9.
Białowieża, a forest on the Polish-Belarusian border, is the largest ancient primeval forest in Europe. Within it, there's a strictly reserved area that has been mostly left alone for thousands of years. With a plethora of bird, reptile, mammal, lichen, fungi, moss, and liverwort species, Białowieża is an important site for ecological and scientific research. Scientists travel from all over the world to discover new interactions between species and to understand biodiversity. And yet, despite years of protection, it was significantly logged in 2010. 6 years later, citing a bark beetle infestation, then Environmental Minister Jan Žižko altered the forest laws and tripled the amount of logging allowed to take place. The minister's personal priest, Tomasz Duszkiewicz, cited the Bible's instruction that man should subdue the land. But activists, ecologists, and scientists claim this was merely a ruse to chop down more of the forest. Activists and NGOs like Greenpeace mobilised, physically protecting the forest against the logging and reporting activity to the European Commission, who found Poland's right-wing nationalist government guilty of violating European environmental law. However, an estimated 10,000 to 180,000 trees were felled.
The key message here is a society-wide transformation is needed to restore the relationship between humans and nature.
Since humans are committing acts of ecological destruction, like the logging of Białowieża, the Earth is now experiencing a sixth mass extinction, with the global wildlife population falling by more than 2/3 as of 2020. This biological annihilation, as worded by Stanford University biologists in a 2017 study, quote, will have negative cascading consequences on ecosystem functioning and services vital to sustaining civilization. So, is there any hope of protecting the natural world from exploitation? In fact, a developing area of law in the United Kingdom called wild law or earth jurisprudence would grant all components of nature legal personality. And there are some precedents. In 2015, the United Nations officially recognized the principles of earth jurisprudence, stating that human rights are meaningless if the ecosystems that sustain us do not have the legal right to exist. In 2008, Ecuador's new constitution included the rights of nature, and in 2010, Bolivia passed a law of the rights of Mother Earth. Also, one piece of New Zealand legislation has been called a new dawn in conservation management. The Te Urewera Act, passed in 2014, granted legal rights to an ancient forest of the same name that is sacred to the Tuhoi people, a tribe of the Maori. Still, our obsession with economic growth is destroying the planet and many lives. But our grief over what we're doing to the world could propel us into action. We can still repair our relationship with the natural world and raise our children to continue the fight to protect it.
Blink 8 of 9.
Although nature's effect on the psyche is not often spoken about in contemporary psychological discourse, Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, was an early advocate of nature's mental health benefits. He believed that we need to acknowledge the primitive layers in our psyche, using the metaphor of a house to illustrate the concept. Imagine two stories. The top floor was added in the 19th century, renovated in the 20th, and given a modern loft extension in the 21st. The ground floor was built in the 16th century with stonework from the 1100s, and the cellar is Roman, beneath which is a Neolithic cave. We spend most of our time now on the top floor and loft extension, but even though we may not live in the other parts of the house or even see them, they still provide the foundation, just like our evolutionary past formed the structure of the human mind.
The key message here is the way we think, write, and talk about nature can reorient us toward our natural biophilia.
We have long turned to nature to make sense of our lives, with early myths full of motifs of floods and serpents, a language rife with idioms like the early bird catches the worm, and even an internet vocabulary with words like web and stream. But our language also limits our ability to appreciate nature's wonders. Instead, our vocabulary for the natural world implies a relationship of owner and property, like the term natural capital, which the British government uses to refer to the value of the country's ecosystems. Even the word nature suggests a separation, as if we are not ourselves part of nature. Environmental collapse sounds like it is happening in a vacuum and we bear no responsibility. An alternative is the more urgent ecocide. By adopting language that views humans as equal to nature, while honestly acknowledging the role we have played in its destruction, we can change the narrative. Academic Nicole Seymour writes about the heteronormativity behind many prominent portrayals of nature. Perhaps we view nature as something to be either dominated or romanticized because of the ubiquity of classic literature about nature written by straight, white, educated men. New perspectives can offer more nuance to the way that we think about nature. Unfortunately, this shift is beginning to happen through public demonstrations and activism. In May 2019, the climate activist group Extinction Rebellion demonstrated in London, forcefully declaring a climate emergency.
Blink 9 of 9.
Svalbard is an Arctic archipelago north of Norway. Only a couple thousand people live there, and in winter it's dark by noon, so you need to carry a flashlight. Polar bears roam around freely. There is only one settled town, Longyearbyen, which is home to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. This vault protects hundreds of thousands of plant seed species, an agricultural safety net in case of global disaster caused by climate change. It's one of hundreds around the world, but it houses the greatest diversity. For Jones, it was a chilling reminder of what our future will look like if we don't alter our course in the wake of ecological collapse. As the climate changes and the environment is compromised, we are increasingly trying to find cushions against the damage. But this isn't a perfect solution. In May 2017, the Svalbard Vault flooded after heavy rain and melting ice. The seeds were fine, but it raised concerns as Longyearbyen is now the fastest warming town on Earth.
The key message here is, to stimulate real, lasting change, we must amend how we design cities, enact legislation, and consider our health.
Technology provides alternatives for connecting with nature when it's inaccessible, like in the Snake River prison experiment, in which videos of nature were better than nothing. But studies have shown that it's no substitute for the real thing. However, fake nature, produced with man-made materials like astroturf, lacks the microorganisms, microbacteria, oxygen, animals, and natural smell, in short, almost everything that makes up the sensory experience. But the reality is that by 2050, 68% of the world's population will live in urban areas. So how can modern living be made greener, especially in cities? Green urbanism would include walkable neighbourhoods, bike-friendly terrain, and sustainable public transport. Cities could also be redesigned in a way that allows for growing food, like in Detroit. Detroit is one example of a city that is now biophilic, thanks to a grassroots movement. Once the hub of the US automobile industry, Detroit became a centre of urban decay after decades of abandonment and disinvestment. Detroit residents, long-time victims of systemic racism that drove poverty and health problems, are now reclaiming their city by transforming the vacant lots and open land into natural spaces. The city currently boasts over 1,500 community gardens and small urban farms, providing residents with fresh, nutritious food. The blueprint exists to help us remake human habitats to incorporate nature. But climate scientists and ecologists tell us that time is running out. We need to restore our relationship with the Earth, to see ourselves as part of the larger ecosystem, not as conquerors of it.
You've just listened to our blinks to Losing Eden by Lucy Jones.
The key message in these blinks is that a lack of connection to nature is harmful because we are all genetically linked to our natural surroundings. Though it's better for children to develop an appreciation for nature early, it's never too late to reactivate your inherent biophilia. Nature can drastically improve mental and therefore physical health. It can thus also improve societal function and close the socio-economic health gap. If you want some more actionable advice, let yourself experience feelings of awe. Awe helps us ease our preoccupation with ourselves and our own suffering. In fact, a University of Toronto experiment showed that awe leads to significantly decreased levels of cytokines, which cause bad inflammation. Other studies showed that awe can abate narcissism and arouse generosity, increase happiness, and strengthen social collectives. So, next time you feel stressed or bogged down in your own head, find a natural spot that inspires awe.